Here's a question. In what year will the world as we know it end? What specific year on the Gregorian calendar would you predict human civilization would cease to exist? Now, if you don't have the answer to that question, there was one 16th century man who claimed to know. You're probably familiar with him. His name was Nostradamus. And under most interpretations, he predicted that the world would end in 1999. Yes, 1999 AD. 1990. Yeah, apparently Nostradamus could use his powers as a seer to realize the Pokemania of 1999 was actually the sign of the end times. During the previous decade in 1982, Prince released a song inspired by Nostradamus titled 1999. The song is all about partying until it's, well, 1999. After all, the end of the world was just 17 years away. I'm sure Nostradamus would have loved to party in Prince's fur boots. Funny enough, the 1990s were actually a period of intense optimism for many in the Western world. After all, the Cold War ended peacefully, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. All that talk about nuclear apocalypse just didn't happen. The titanic battle between communism and capitalism that could have tore the world apart didn't end with nuclear winter, but with a Berlin block party, followed by the leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, making an appearance in a Pizza Hut commercial.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Apartheid in South Africa collapsed shortly afterwards, and the globalization of the earth kicked off into high gear. The zeitgeist was so upbeat that the biggest issue to worry about during this decade was Bill Clinton getting a suck in the Oval Office. In 1993, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote that we were at the end of history in his book, End of History and the Last Man. In this book, Fukuyama argues that the end of the Cold War ushered an epoch in which liberal democracy and capitalism would stand supreme after defeating fascism and communism during the 21st century. 6 years later on, the earth crumbled into dust, and the devout were taken up into the heavenly ether, while the sinners were consumed in ash. Wait, sorry, I made a mistake. Fact check. The world did not end in 1999. Sorry for the spoiler alert. Many Nostradamus enthusiasts claim that the world would end once we transition from 1999 to the year 2000. This was during the Y2K hysteria, when many speculated that computing errors related to the Gregorian calendar would result in a catastrophe, as the two last digits in 1999, being 99, would change to two zeros, as in the year 1900. Governments and corporations worked around the clock to mitigate any potential cataclysmic events. Meanwhile, doomsdayers were stockpiling filtered water and canned food. As far as I'm concerned, if surviving the end of the world means eating baked beans for the rest of my life, I'd rather perish. The clock was approaching midnight on December 31st, 1999. And when all the fireworks erupted at the birth of the new millennium, many aircraft fell out of the sky, cruise missiles were launched without authorization, and yeah, no, just kidding, nothing happened. Well, some things happened. Some digital clocks did claim that we were living in the year 1900. Alas, there was no time travel involved, and President Teddy Roosevelt didn't come back from the dead. Turns out, Nostradamus was kinda full of shit. Maybe he should have spent more time staring at the moon or listening to God more carefully. Since then, many have attributed his prophecies to numerous historical events, from Napoleon to Pearl Harbor, to the creation of the modern state of Israel, to Elvis dying on the toilet seat. But these are all post hoc explanations, stretching out what is essentially a series of very vague statements made by a guy who lived in an era when most people bathed a few times a year. The question of when the world will end, or at the very least, when human civilization will end, has been one of fascination in the realms of folklore, mythology, religion, science, science fiction, futurism, military analysis, as well as the purview of countless old bearded guys living in underground self-made bunkers in the wilderness. I prefer a life of not getting ticks, but hey, each to their own. I hope they invent a cure for Lyme disease after civilization crumbles. Anyway, this is a series of videos on the end of the world. In each video of the series, I will go over various doomsday scenarios, from nuclear winter, to supervolcanoes, to robot revolts, environmental catastrophe, to transhumanism. But for the rest of this video, I want to start off this series by looking at some of the ways in which various cultures of the past viewed the end of the world. Oh, by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. How rude of me. My channel is called The Wizard of Wit. A bit of an egocentric name, but I like it that way. I cover a variety of subjects in an insightful and humorous manner. If you're interested, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Time to break open the packages of water filters and iodine pills and begin. End of the world tales have probably existed as long as humans could communicate ideas beyond the here and now. But this was done through the oral tradition, passing down stories near the campfire, with each story tweaking the story to the point when the original story barely had any relation to the latest tale. However, this changed to an extent when humans developed a writing system. After all, it's kind of hard to fake writing. Well, there are forgeries, but certainly requires a lot more effort than just bullshitting something out of thin air while you talk. The first to use a writing system were the Sumerians. Now, the Sumerians did not believe in a final apocalypse like later cultures. Instead, their main quote-unquote world-ending event, if you could call it that, was the Great Flood, which was meant to destroy humanity, not the cosmos itself. In texts such as the Eridu Genesis, dating all the way back to 2300 BCE, the gods decided to wipe out humans because they were overpopulated and apparently really noisy. Yeah, the gods were tired of humans babbling, so they decided to kill nearly all of them. Apparently, telling them to keep quiet wasn't an option, and anger management didn't exist during the Bronze Age. The god Enlil pushes for a plan of destruction, but Enki, the god of wisdom, secretly warns a righteous king. The king was told to build a giant boat. As the flood devastates the land, killing most humans, the king survives with his family and the animals that he rescued, and humanity is allowed to continue after the god's destruction. If this story sounds familiar, that's because the Bible story of Noah's Ark was clearly inspired by it. Maybe creationists will create a museum shaped like a boat based off of the one from Sumerian mythology, but I doubt it. On a more serious note, the original story was probably based off of the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which were oftentimes unpredictable and highly destructive. If you were a villager at this time who knew almost nothing about the world outside of your village, then your village flooding probably was kind of like the end of the known world. Such is the power of scope when it comes to what constitutes what we see as the world. Now let's move on to Greek philosophy and mythology. In the Greek world, time wasn't linear. It was, however, rational, and it existed in cycles. Greek mythology involves numerous mythical ages: the Gold, Silver, Bronze, and Iron Age, all ending in decline. Now, this is vastly different than our modern view of the world, which tends to view the future in a more positive light, the eternal march towards progress. Instead, this is an eternal march towards decline. Each age sucks even harder than the last one. The ancient Greeks were less optimistic and more like the depressed emo kids of the 2000s, but in a classical context. Periodic destruction by fire and floods were awaiting them all. Philosophers like the Stoics believed that the universe is cyclical as well, being destroyed but also reborn. Plato also suggested that civilizations periodically collapse primarily due to natural disasters. And if anything, this is largely correct, and we will get to environmental catastrophes in a later episode of the series. Now let's move on to another culture that is just as, if not more, influential than those of the Greeks: the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, the Judeo-Christian worldview sees time in a linear manner, as in there's a beginning and then there's an end, with a final apocalypse and final judgment under some interpretations. Keep in mind that Christianity is rooted in Jewish apocalyptic traditions that, contrary to the belief of many Christians, are actually not that mainstream in Judaism today. Despite Judaism being the bedrock of Christianity, Judaism lacks the emphasis on the end of the world. However, Judaism did have an ancient apocalyptic tradition, such as the Tanakh's Book of Daniel, as well as non-canon books like the first book of Enoch. The oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible are the Dead Sea Scrolls. It turns out that there was not one Judaism, but many Judaisms. One of these sects were known as the Essenes, who wrote of God's final judgment and the coming of the Messiah. Sound familiar? While Jews would eventually cut the doom and gloom of the end times out of their theology after the destruction of the Second Temple, after all, they've kind of experienced the end of the world and rebirth in that sense, these pre-existing beliefs would influence Christianity and Islam. The last book of the New Testament is the Book of Revelations. This is quite possibly the most bizarre and sci-fi-esque book in the entire Bible. It involves the Antichrist, as we all know. It involves 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, being conquest, war, famine, and death. Now, I personally find the last horseman, death, to be a little bit redundant, given that the first 3 all cause death, but hey, I'm not God, so I don't have a say in this. It also turns out that the snake in the Garden of Eden, who had tempted Adam and Eve, was actually Satan. If you ask me, this is brilliant retconning. It also mentions the final battle of Armageddon. Keep in mind that Armageddon is a real place. You can actually find the small town of Armageddon on Google Maps. Today it's known as Tel Megiddo. They even have a nice coffee shop called Rodeo Truck, so you can enjoy some nice croissants and muffins before the world crumbles. Now, Christians debate many of the specifics of how the end times will happen, but nearly all of them include Judgment Day, in which God casts out the enemies while saving the devout. Satan is destroyed, and it all ends with a new heaven and a new earth, the final destination. History here has a definitive and highly destructive end, followed by a redeemed and eternal future. Keep in mind that this has inspired Christians for millennia. For example, in the 19th century, there was a man by the name of William Miller who predicted Christ's return in 1844. Yeah, he was very, very specific. 1844. Apparently, Christ really likes cowboys. Well, it turned out that nothing happened. Christ did not come back in 1844, and this became known as the Great Disappointment. It's rather depressing when people consider the end of the world not happening to be a disappointment, but I guess if you think you're going to go to heaven, then it would be a disappointment. Nonetheless, his failed prediction did lead to the Adventist movement, which reinterpreted the events spiritually in a post hoc manner. This ordeal shows us that the human mind can come to conclusions without facts and logic. And if you use facts and logic to change their mind, then they're not going to change their mind because they didn't come to their initial conclusion using facts and logic. Now, keep in mind that before I sound like a Reddit atheist, part of me does respect William Miller for being able to bullshit all those people so bluntly. And he still has useful idiots believing in this to this day. To be very fair and clear though, the vast majority of Christians do not put a specific date on when Christ will come back, and most of them accept the uncertainty. Now let's move on to Islam. Now, Islam is an Abrahamic religion that adapts many ideas which were borrowed from Judaism and Christianity when it comes to the end times, oftentimes mixed with elements of Arabian polytheism that Muhammad was surrounded by when he was growing up. Like Christianity, this involves a lot of emphasis on moral accountability, as well as cosmic signs of the end times. The end times include signs of moral decay, along with natural disasters. Perhaps too many people were eating ham. This is followed by the appearance of the Mahdi, who would unite the world of Islam under Islamic piety. This would also involve the return of Isa, also known as Jesus, Isa being the Arabic name or Arabic version of Jesus. Yep, Jesus is a second coming in Islam as well. He defeats the Dajjal, which is basically another word for the Antichrist. Yeah, copyright infringement wasn't enforced during the Middle Ages, don't at me. After all the mass destruction, all the souls are resurrected and judged. This is another example of how cultures will attach their narratives and ideas to those of pre-existing cultures. mixing and matching and then creating new results. Now let's exit the deserts of Arabia for the boreal forests of Scandinavia. The Norse believed in the inevitable destruction of the world, ending in the death of the gods they worshipped. Ragnarok is the doom of the gods and the various worlds. And while this battle didn't involve the Hulk, it did lead to the death of Thor, Odin, and Loki, among other gods and goddesses. The events include an endless winter, gods and monsters killing each other, a world consumed by fire and ice. Afterwards, a renewed world emerges, with the surviving gods, along with one man and one woman to repopulate the world. Now, this incestuous rebirth is probably not the best for avoiding birth defects, but it is a lot better than extinction. Maybe the future the Norse envisioned was similar to what Pakistan looks like today, given all of that inbreeding. In the words of Dr. Malcolm from Jurassic Park,
life finds a way.
Now let's move on to the other side of the world. In the Americas, most of you have heard of the factoid that the Mayans believed the world would end in 2012. This prophecy even inspired a mediocre disaster movie called 2012. Now, speaking of shitty movies, the worst animated movie / nightmare fuel of all time was Food Fight that came out in 2012, which to me is a sign of the end times. Now let's go back to the Mayans. They believed that past cycles were said to have ended by floods, darkness, and civilizational collapse. And while not as bad as the movies of 2012 and Food Fight, civilizational ending floods are a common trope in end times theology. This 2012 doomsday prediction hasn't aged well since 2013. But that's not the Mayans' fault, because they didn't actually predict that the world would end. Instead, it was the end of a cycle, followed by the emergence of another cycle. This is one example of many, in which people from one culture interpret another culture by projecting their own worldview onto a completely different one. The misinterpretation that 2012 was the end of the world according to the Mayans is one in which the Abrahamic and scientific views of the Western world were plastered onto the Mesoamerican world. Now, I'm not going to leave the Mayans off the hook completely. They did predict that the cycle would end due to flooding, when, if anything, it was actually the other way around. The Mayan civilization collapsed not due to excess flooding, but actually due to drought. Their civilization would collapse, but in a new cycle, another Mesoamerican civilization would emerge, the Aztecs. Now, the Aztecs also believed in a cyclical worldview. They believed that cycles of destruction through cosmic ages were turning and turning. The universe had already passed through 4 suns. There were 5 suns in total, at least at that point, each ending in various cataclysms. The first sun was a collapse by jaguars, which is quite possibly the most original and badass end time story of all time. The next 3 suns are a lot more boring. You got destruction by wind, destruction by fire, and the 4th sun was destruction by flooding. Come on, Aztecs, you could have gotten more creative for those other 3. Now, the Aztecs believed that they were in the 5th cosmic age. They believed that their world survived only through human sacrifices to appease the gods. Now, to our modern sensibilities, human sacrifices are really fucked up. But if you genuinely believe that the world would end without human sacrifices, then logically you would come to the conclusion that ripping people's hearts out was necessary to stop the end of the world. This worldview gave humans the power to delay the end times, granted by ending people's ability to pump blood through their veins. Alas, the 5th sun did arrive, but not through floods, fire, or jaguars, but rather by a people group who are quite fond of tapas, the Spaniards. The last Aztec emperor, Montezuma, thought that the leader of the Spanish, Hernando Cortez, was a god. Having an alien technologically advanced culture wipe out your entire empire in a brief period of time is the closest history has ever gotten to a sci-fi novel. Disease and superior technology led to the collapse of the Aztec Empire in a flash, along with much of the population, a real-world regional apocalypse. Say what you want about the Spaniards, but they weren't fond of the human sacrifices, and forced the practice to a halt. Thankfully, the world did not end when the human sacrifices ended. Well, to be clear, the world did sort of kind of end. Not only was Aztec and Mesoamerican culture destroyed and subjugated by the Spaniards, but their worldview itself, in a way, ended. Their religion was replaced with Catholicism, and many people in Mesoamerica wondered, hey, the human sacrifices ended, but the world didn't completely end as in all things got destroyed. Our civilization got destroyed, but not the actual Earth. So maybe the human sacrifices weren't necessary, and maybe our entire meta-narrative turned out to be BS. In a way, they were proven right and wrong at the same time. Now keep in mind that it's easy to pass these doomsday stories as superstitions from a long time ago by backward people, but plenty of people in the modern day have spoken of the end times. The 20th century had plenty of doomsday cults, such as Heaven's Gate, when a bunch of people thought that they would seek alien salvation via mass self-deletion. There was also the Jonestown Massacre, in which apocalyptic paranoia led to mass self-deletion via Kool-Aid and cyanide. There were the Branch Davidians, in which a guy who was quite fond of child brides had a revelation that the end times were coming and he got to have as many 11-year-old brides as he wished. Alas, the FBI thought otherwise. There were even sarin gas attacks in Tokyo by a doomsday cult during the 1990s. All these cults had a couple things in common. Usually a charismatic leader, they had an us versus them worldview, and their worldviews all ended. They all promised the end of the world, but what actually ended up happening was their specific worlds collapsed, as in the worlds of their cults, as they oftentimes just self-deleted or were locked up in prison. These cults didn't predict the end of the world, but they correctly predicted the end of themselves. The end times also inspired numerous fiction writers. Most of these are secular, but you do occasionally get some religious elements as well, such as the Left Behind series, in which a Christian rapture occurs, bringing the believers into heaven while the fedora-tipping atheists burn in piles of ash. Whether or not this could be considered fiction is debatable, since the authors consider it to be something that will happen. But when it comes to actual fiction, we have the secularized apocalypse. This is very common in various forms of science fiction and fantasy. You have nuclear war scenarios such as seen in the Mad Max movies. You have pandemic movies such as Station 11 and the prelude to Planet of the Apes. You have movies like The Day After Tomorrow, which depicts a world in which a new ice age emerges. And you also have movies like The Terminator, in which super intelligent robots are out to destroy humanity. Now, unlike the religious apocalypses that were discussed before, there's no divine judgment. There's more of a focus on survival, ethics, and rebuilding the world based on human terms. What does it mean to be human without human civilization after we've already had human civilization? There are overarching patterns across various cultures when it comes to end-time stories. The end times is usually depicted as being the result of moral failure, whether it's angering the gods or not recycling enough and polluting the atmosphere so we get climate change. There is oftentimes some sort of reset into which a better world emerges out of the ash and rubble. The apocalypse reveals hidden truths that humans didn't previously know. There is also a deep fear of chaos in an organized world. In many ways, these apocalyptic scenarios say less about the hardship of what will happen during and after the cataclysm, and more about what our fears and anxieties are about our present-day life.